Today, let's talk about the age of totalitarianism, part one. We'll talk about Russia first, and then later we'll talk about Germany and a little bit about Italy. So Russia, let's start with Russia. Russia, as we all know, had the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution ended up going quickly into a civil war. The Civil War, of course, had many different aspects to it. It took about 4 years. The Bolsheviks won the Civil War, just barely, but they won it. Simultaneously, there was a war going on with Poland. And at the very beginning, right after the end, even after the end of World War I, and after the successful Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks still had to deal with foreign troops that were on their soil. The Czechs had about anywhere from 50 to 100,000, depending on who you listen to, but they had a large group that were traveling through Russia when in fact the revolution happened, and they will actually turn against the revolution. There were actually British troops, there were French troops, there were many troops that attempted to undo the revolution and abolish the rule of the Bolsheviks. So let's restart. Let's talk about Russia. Russia clearly goes into a totalitarian regime. Even from the very beginning, some would argue that it had to because of the foreign intervention, because of the whites who fought the Reds for the control of Russia. Really, the Bolshevik Revolution is on the defensive right away. And a couple things that we have to remember, let's say the sort of the ideological background to all of this. The leader of the movement, as we all know, was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And Lenin was the acknowledged leader of the Bolsheviks. He was considered himself to be a professional revolutionary. He was a Marxist. He was the one who actually adapted Marxism to Russian conditions. That is to say, Russia was extremely backwards. It will remain backwards for even under the Bolsheviks for some time. It was a country of enormous poverty, enormous backwardness. And if you know what Marx had said, Marx had always said that the revolution would come to Russia last. It would come to at least undeveloped countries last, because in order to get to a communist revolution, you first have to have the development of capitalism. Capitalism will not only develop a country, but it will develop a working class. The working class will become alienated. Class conflict will lead to class struggle, and eventually war. And of course, Marx predicted that the proletariat revolution would be successful. The problem is, in Russia, there wasn't much of a proletariat. There wasn't much of capitalist development. It was only in kind of its infancy. And so Lenin will adapt Marxism to Leninist specifications from the very beginning. And what that means is, in place of the proletariat, in place of a proletarian sort of class conflict, the party, the Bolshevik party in this case, the Communist Party, would stand in its stead. So right from the beginning, you're going to have something, you might say, the revolution will be imposed from above. And what it means is the party will substitute itself for the class. And that becomes the model. So basically, Lenin is organizing a group of professional revolutionaries like him, like himself, and that'll be the vanguard. And that is that's what the leadership is going to be in Russia. Remember that Russia was run by the Tsars. Nicholas II was the Tsar, and it was to a large extent, many would say, would agree, it was already a kind of a police state to begin with. So Lenin has to be very careful. So the group that he runs, his party, will have to operate more or less clandestinely. Russia has a revolution as early as 1905 when it loses a war to the Japanese, and there is sort of mild reform between 1905 and 1917. The Tsar grants a very limited constitution, introduces a little bit of democracy, not democracy, but at least some rights, a constitution, and things improve slightly, but not nearly enough. And then in 1914, the Tsar of the Russian government honors its commitments to alliances with the British and the French, and it gets involved in the war and stays in the war. And the war is devastating for Russia, already a backward country. And in 1917, not too surprisingly, as the Russian army is breaking down, and literally the peasant army walking home in many cases. The first revolution occurs in 1917, and it's not the Bolshevik Revolution, but it's the first revolution led by the socialist revolutionaries, themselves socialists, but of a totally different kind. Eventually, the most important person in the new government will not be the one who actually heads the government, Prince Lvov, but it will be Alexander Kerensky. And by midsummer or so, he emerges as the head of the government, and Kerensky takes over. The problem with Kerensky, well, number one, he doesn't leave the war, so he maintains the war effort. Number two, he refuses any kind of agrarian reform to help the peasant out, and the peasants fighting the war. So, as you can imagine, it's not a big surprise that there's a Bolshevik Revolution helped along by the continued war effort in November. It depends how you did, which calendar you actually are on. But the October-November revolution led by Lenin. That revolution succeeds. It's more of a coup d'etat, but it does succeed. The Bolsheviks take over power, and as I indicated earlier on, right from the very beginning, they're going to have a civil war on their hands, as the former leaders of the Tsarist army will now lead the effort to topple the Bolshevik government. So Lenin institutes essentially war communism, and war communism is the building of communism theoretically during war conditions, and it's unintentionally perhaps, but it's going to become kind of a model for the totalitarian state later on. What was war communism? War communism is where the state literally takes over everything. The state takes over all production. The state requisitions grain from the peasantry in order to feed the army and the cities. The state takes over all of industry. The state decides on quotas for everything. And it is essentially a top-down model for running the war effort. And of course, in order to deal with those who are resisting, not only does the Red Army have to be built up, which it will be under Trotsky, but also the secret police, first known as the Cheka, and later going through a number of different iterations. But in any case, the Cheka becomes the secret police, and it really is a police state from the very beginning. Eventually, the Bolsheviks are successful, but at a huge price, because the war has cost something like 1.5 million soldiers their lives, hundreds of thousands of peasants, others have died as well, and essentially war communism, which was run, by the way, without a currency, so everything was literally requisitioned by the government, controlled by the government. War communism is going to have to be somehow changed after the victory of the Civil War. And in 1921, there's actually what's called the Kronstadt Rebellion, and it's led by the sailors in Kronstadt who wanted, they essentially lived under war conditions, very tough conditions, for 4 years of war communism, and now want the government to let up and to allow some sort of, let's say, limited capitalism, some sort of a market regime. And Lenin is going to have to give in on that, and so what is adopted in 1921 is the new economic policy, which allows the peasantry, actually, some free marketing. They can hire people, for example, so they can actually hire labor, workers. They can make money through the market after they pay their taxes to the government, taxes in kind or taxes in any case. So there's some marketing going on, but it's going to be a problem. There's a couple of good harvests, 1922, 1923, and then NEP seems to work fairly well. But at the same time, there was a feeling among some, Trotsky's actually one of them, that if the country doesn't industrialize extremely fast, it's going to be very vulnerable. And that's the reason is because the communist revolution has not spread to other countries. And the Bolshevik leadership feels that it's too isolated and it might be too vulnerable. And the West, of course, would like to abolish, get rid of the communist government in Russia. So there's this feeling that Russia is too isolated. and needs to industrialize as fast as possible. Stalin is going to be one of those, and he's going to attempt to impose industrialization, and that's going to eventually lead to, of course, collective farms. One of the things that happens at the beginning of the NEP is that Lenin decides that he doesn't want factionalism within the party because it would be too divisive, it would be too hurtful, it would retard the revolution and the making of communism. And he passed a law in 1921 which is against factions in the party. That's a dangerous thing to do because that essentially means that you're on the road to not only the one-party state, but to the one-party dictatorship, because there can't be factions, which means there can't be disagreements, there can't be a cabal, there can't be a group going against another group that holds the power. That was 1921. 1922, there's another problem that emerges, and Lenin has his first stroke, and he's incapacitated for some time. And it's in this sort of this period. He returns to work approximately September of 1922, but it's in a period when he's somewhat incapacitated that Stalin's rise is going to be occurring. And Lenin's already aware of Stalin's penchant for taking power, grabbing power. And then another complication is that Stalin is also the general secretary of the party. He's a commissar of nationalities. This gives him tremendous leverage in terms of building up patronage within the party. It's going to give him leverage over Trotsky ultimately because he runs the agenda, he runs the nationalities program, etc. By 1924, Lenin, who has serious reservations about Stalin, dies after suffering his third stroke early in the year. And that's going to help Stalin rise. His rise will become even more dramatic after that. He no longer has to worry about Lenin. So for the next couple of years, Stalin will really take hold of the party more and more. It's in those years it begins the expulsion of Trotsky by 1927. Trotsky's not even in the party anymore. Remember, he's the one who actually formed the Red Army. And by the time we get to 1928, Stalin is ready to not only abandon the NEP, which he does, but he begins to organize, or actually plan, the 5-year plan comes into existence. The 5-year plan, essentially, is the collectivization of agriculture. And this is going to essentially industrialize the countryside. Essentially, it's going to mean that the peasants can no longer own anything. They can't own land. They can't own livestock, they can't own their own tools. Everything is going to be collectivized, and the state theoretically provides things like tractors and whatever is needed. The peasants who still work on these collectives will be given grants of food and so on, a very small income, once or twice a year they have some income, but for the most part they're simply factory workers on the farm. There's going to be tremendous resistance to this. Ultimately, of course, it's going to fail. It'll lead to famine and so on and so forth. So what we have by 1929, the 5-year plan is put into place. You have now a single party running the state, so a single irremovable party. You have one man in charge of that party, having removed any possible opposition against him. You have the industrialization of the countryside. You have the organization and continuation of the secret police, the NKVD, and that's where you have the making of the totalitarian state. The totalitarian state essentially is where the state controls everything. And that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to control the small shops. It's going to control industry. It's going to control trade. Virtually everything. It cannot be removed from power. There is no such thing as a constitution, although in 1936 Stalin actually grants one, interestingly enough, and it sounds like a very liberal one, but of course it's not. It's never really applied. The other thing that happens in the 1930s is there is tremendous resistance, and people who resist, well, they're put into the Gulag Archipelago, as Solzhenitsyn will call it. Many are sent north of the Arctic Circle, which means that they can't possibly survive there. And essentially you have now the makings of totalitarian state, which means that nobody has privacy. There's no public life. and so on and so forth. One little anecdote for that, Stalin will build, it's called Gorky Park, still around. In fact, it was recently made into a very, very beautiful park. Gorky Park, the whole idea of Gorky Park was to try and bring people out into the open, get them out into the open. It's like a big circus, really, is what it was, a carnival. And the idea was that if people stay kind of in their apartments, in their own private residences, it's more difficult to actually know what they're thinking. It's more difficult to spy on them. So Stalin likes very much for people to be in public where they can be watched. There's your totalitarian state. The totalitarian state means essentially there's no private space anymore. There's no difference, no distinction between public and private. Essentially, there is no private. And that's the makings of the totalitarian state in Russia. Thank you. See you next time.